you will learn how to leverage Azure Service Connector in order to simplify connection to your Azure services. What is the issue that will be solved by Azure Service Connector? So let's say you have an Azure service like container apps or AKS or app service or functions, and from that application you want to connect to another target service like, for example, a storage account or key vault or config apps or service bus or SQL Server database. For that, you need to make sure that your application have the right airbag access in order to access that target resource, and you'll need to make sure that also your application have network access over that service. This could be done manually, and in most of the cases today this is done manually. But now with Azure Service Connector, most of these steps could be automated. So first of all, Azure Service Connector will make sure that the identity used by your application have the right airbag roles and assignments over the target service. So to connect to the storage account here, for example, it should have the role storage blob reader, for example, or contributor. And then for your application to be able to use that managed identity or to use the SPN service principal or connection string, we typically pass those values as an environment variable. So for the managed identity, that's going to be the principal ID or the object ID. And this now could be done by Azure Service Connector. So then when your application starts, it will read from its environment variables those data, and then it uses it in order to access the storage account. In addition to that, for example, with AKS, you can use federated credentials with the managed identity. Azure Service Connector can configure the required federated credentials, and it can also go to enable workload identity and OIDC in your AKS cluster. So it will make all the required changes. So that's for the identity side. Now, in addition to this, the Azure Service Connector will also make sure that your service can connect to the target service, like the storage account right here. So if that storage account is publicly accessible, then that's fine. But if it's behind a private endpoint and the public access is disabled, then the Service Connector will go to make sure that private endpoint could be resolved through a private DNS zone. If there is no private DNS zone, then it will go to create that private DNS zone for you. Creating a private DNS zone might not be accepted or validated by the infra team, but if the infra here is managed by the application team who does not have lots of knowledge about the infrastructure and the network in Azure, then Service Connector could be really helpful here. So with all of these changes, now the application should be able to access the target resource. Azure Service Connector is supported in multiple Azure services like App Service, Functions, Spring Apps, Container Apps, and AKS. And it supports also multiple target services like Azure AI Services, App Configuration, Azure Cache for Redis, Cosmos DB, Azure Database for Postgres, for MySQL, Vault, Storage Account, and many more. Follow me in the next video for a demonstration on how we can enable Azure Service Connector in Azure Container Apps in order to connect to a storage account.